Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and it's a real pleasure. And thank you, Prabhu Devanerji, for organizing this whole thing, and thank you all for coming. So I thought I would speak today on the topic of Sri Ramakrishna, the prophet of harmony. So in Bengali and Indian languages in general, devotees of Sri Ramakrishna often refer to him as Samanvaya Avatar, Shamanvaya Avatar. The avatara, the incarnation, the divine incarnation of harmony. And we often say, if anybody is familiar with Sri Ramakrishna, ordinary people on the street, the one thing they'll probably know is that he taught as many faiths, so many paths, Joto Mot, Toto Pot. I wanted to go a little bit more deeply into in what sense he was the harmonizing avatara, a harmonizing incarnation. What did he harmonize exactly? And how did he harmonize different paths, different philosophies, different religions? And the other thing I wanted to emphasize from the beginning is this was not an intellectual, he was not an intellectual in the traditional sense. So he was not just coming up with theories to harmonize different ideas and philosophies. He was what we can call a spiritual scientist. He conducted spiritual experiments and actually verified the truths of different religions and different spiritual paths. So that's very important to keep in mind. He was not presenting intellectual hypotheses, but speaking on the basis of his own direct experience. And I wanted to mention two quotations about some great souls, what they felt about Sri Ramakrishna, in what sense he was such a great personage. So one is Vivekananda wrote a letter in 1894 to his brother disciple, Swami Ramakrishna. He wrote, "My dear brother, that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was God incarnate, I have not the least doubt. His life is a searchlight of infinite power thrown upon the whole mass of Indian religious thought. He was a living commentary to the Vedas and to their aim. He had lived in one life the whole cycle of the national religious existence in India. Whether Bhagavan Sri Krishna was born at all, we are not sure. And avatars like Buddha and Chaitanya are monotonous. Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is the latest and the most perfect, the concentrated embodiment of knowledge, love, renunciation, catholicity, and the desire to serve mankind. So where is anyone to compare with him? He must have been born in vain who cannot appreciate him." So notice that one of the things that Vivekananda is emphasizing here, what makes Sri Ramakrishna such a great avatar, even among the avatars, what makes him unique is his ability to harmonize different spiritual paths, this catholicity. And Sri Aurobindo, another great yogi who was influenced by both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, in 1908, he said this about Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Aurobindo said, "Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all the avatars. For while others felt God in a single or limited aspect, he, Sri Ramakrishna, felt God in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety." This is in typically Aurobindonian English. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but the idea, but it's very beautiful English actually. And he's saying that what makes him the greatest of all avatars is that he realized God in multiple aspects and forms, not just in one aspect or form, and taught that there's the same God realized in many different ways by different sages in different countries throughout the world. So these are just two quotations I wanted to give as a kind of framework for our discussion. So I wanted to mention three different ways that Sri Ramakrishna was the avatara of harmony. And the first is a little bit philosophical, a little bit technical, but I think it's very important. I want to explain briefly how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the different schools of Vedanta. Why do I think it's important? Because all of our societies, or most of our societies outside of India, are called Vedanta societies. And Vedanta is a word that's very commonly used in India and throughout the world, but there's a lot of confusion about what it means exactly. So I think it's very important, first of all, to just try to have some understanding of what does Vedanta mean? What are some of the basic ideas in the different schools of Vedanta? And then how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize these different schools? First of all, what's important is that many of you use Wikipedia, I assume, right? Almost all of you. And in Wikipedia, if you type in the word, for instance, Michael Jackson, what happens is there's the famous pop star, Michael Jackson, but there are also other Michael Jacksons. And then you have to go to a disambiguation page. And you have to say which Michael Jackson you're referring to. In the same way, we have to disambiguate the concept of Vedanta because Vedanta has different meanings in different contexts. So the primary meaning of Vedanta is the Upanishads, which is part of the Vedas. It's considered to be the culminating portion of the Vedic scriptures in Hinduism. So Vedanta equals Upanishads. That's one meaning. And in some contexts, when people refer to Vedanta, they're thinking of Upanishads. In other contexts, they're not thinking of Upanishads. But the first question to ask when somebody uses the word Vedanta is you can ask them, what do you mean by Vedanta? So the first meaning is Upanishads. There's a second meaning of Vedanta. Upanishads, but it also includes two other scriptures. Can anyone guess what the other two scriptures are that Vedanta? And? Exactly. So the second meaning of Vedanta is Upanishads plus Bhagavad Gita plus Brahma Sutras. These three texts, which are considered the Prasthanatraya of Vedanta, the foundational scriptures of Vedanta, these three scriptures. Okay? That's the second meaning of Vedanta. There's also a third meaning of Vedanta. So you see how confusing it can be. The third meaning of Vedanta is, here we get into philosophical territory. Centuries after the Upanishads came, different schools of philosophy emerged on the basis of the Vedas. And there are different classifications, but one of the standard classifications says that there are 6 Astika schools of Indian philosophy. And what Astika means is they accept the authority of the Vedas. And there are 3 Nastika schools of Indian philosophy, which means those schools do not accept the authority of the Vedas. Okay? The 3 Nastika schools are Buddhism, and can anyone guess the other 2 schools which do not accept the Vedas as authoritative? Huh? Jainism and Buddhism, Jainism, the third. And one more.
6.
It's a very popular philosophy in this world, in Zurich and other places. Charvaka. Charvaka materialism. So Charvaka is a very old philosophical school which believes that there's nothing but matter. They don't believe in any higher realities, no soul, no God. When the physical body dies, consciousness ceases, and that's it. So it's better to enjoy life while we can. This is Charvaka philosophy. So these are the 3 Nastika schools: Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvaka materialism. There are 6 Astika schools of Indian philosophy. Can anyone mention some of these 6 schools? Any? Yeah, good, exactly. So let's start with Sankhya. Sankhya, and what's the sister philosophy of Sankhya? Very famous now throughout the world because of yoga asanas and yoga philosophy, yoga. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Yeah, so the yoga school. So Sankhya and yoga are actually, they're considered to be sister philosophies. The reason is because yoga philosophy is based on the metaphysics of Sankhya. So Sankhya and yoga, Nyaya and Vaisheshika, these are also paired together because Nyaya and Vaisheshika have very similar doctrines. Those are considered to be the logical schools of Indian philosophy, Nyaya, Vaisheshika. And the 5th and 6th are Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa is a school of ritualism based on the Vedic rituals. The whole philosophy is based on Vedic ritualism. And Uttara Mimamsa is Vedanta in this 3rd sense. Okay? So Vedanta in this 3rd sense is one of the 6 Astika schools of Indian philosophy. So you see, in this Wikipedia page, there are at least 3 different meanings of Vedanta. One is Upanishads. Second is the Prasthanatraya, Upanishads plus Bhagavad Gita plus Brahma Sutra. And the 3rd meaning is one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy that accept the authority of the Vedas. Now, to make things even more complicated, that one school of Vedanta, which is one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy that accepts the Vedas, they're sub-schools. So the most famous, or one of the most famous sub-schools of Vedanta is Shankara's. What's his philosophy? Shankaracharya? Advaita Vedanta. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, right? But there are also other schools of Vedanta, which are completely different from Shankara's philosophy. But they're also Vedanta. All of these schools are Vedanta. One of them is Ramanuja's philosophy. What is his called? Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. Qualified non-dualism. Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta. Chaitanya's Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta. Vallabha's Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta. And there are other Bheda schools. Bheda means difference. Abheda means non-difference. So these are schools that believe in difference and non-difference. So there are many schools of Vedanta, all teaching different doctrines. Most of us, when we think of Vedanta, we make the mistake of equating Vedanta with Advaita Vedanta. That's a serious mistake, because there are many schools of Vedanta. And Ramanuja, Madhva, Chaitanya, Vallabha, their schools are devotional schools. They're based on bhakti. They're called bhakti schools of Vedanta. And if any of you are interested, you can read a very nice book written by Swami Tapasanandaji, who is the vice president of our order. The book is called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And he begins by saying that most people think that Vedanta means Advaita, but in fact, there are beautiful Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And the whole book he devotes the entire book to explaining the doctrines of each of these Bhakti Schools of Vedanta in great detail. So I recommend that book. And in the introduction to that book, he has a very nice, about 20 to 25 page introduction explaining how Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonized the different schools of Vedanta. So I'll be talking a little bit about that now. But in order to understand that, we have to have some idea of some of the main doctrines of these different schools of Vedanta. Let's start with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, the best known school of Vedanta. Everyone most likely knows the famous formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, and then it continues, Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. So Brahman alone is real. This entire world of names and forms is unreal. But what is Brahman? What is the nature of Brahman? According to Shankara, does anyone know? Brahman means the ultimate reality. What is its swarupa? Well, no, yes, Satchitananda, but everybody accepts Satchitananda. Even Ramanuja accepts that Brahman is Satchitananda. But Shankara says that Brahman is ultimately only nirguna. That's the Sanskrit word, or nirvishesha, which means without attributes. And it also means it's impersonal. So he does not believe in the ultimate reality of the personal God. The personal God means the loving God, the God of love, who responds to our prayers, right? When we pray, we like to think that there's a God who's listening to our prayers, who can answer our prayers, who creates this world, preserves this world, ultimately at the end of time destroys this world. This is what's called the personal God, who is omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, perfectly good, right? This is the personal God. Shankaracharya says that this is the personal God, this entire world of diversity with this table and this chair and this TV, and each of us as individual souls. These are only real from the empirical standpoint. In Sanskrit, the term is vyavaharika, from the empirical standpoint, which means these are only real. The personal God, this entire world, our individualities are real only so long as we are ignorant of the highest reality, which is non-dual, pure consciousness. The moment we realize Brahman, everything else vanishes. And then we realize this personal God was not real. I, as Swami Medhanandaji, was not real. This table is not real. There's only Brahman all along. So this is Shankara's philosophy. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now let's come to some of the bhakti schools of Vedanta. Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita. He also accepts that Brahman is the highest reality, but his understanding of Brahman is completely different from Shankara's. You can say it's the opposite of Shankara's. Why? Because he held that Brahman is only personal. Saguna is a Sanskrit term. Brahman is the personal God, Vishnu, Narayana, who is omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, who is the creator of this world, and he preserves this world. He's the ruler of this world. He is the antaryami. He is the inner ruler in each of our hearts, guiding us. And he says Shankara is wrong in thinking that Brahman is nirguna. So there are centuries long debates about the nature of Brahman between the different schools of Vedanta. Okay? And so Ramanuja is writing after Shankaracharya existed in the 8th century, most likely. Ramanuja came several centuries later and he wrote a whole book refuting Shankara's views. And then somebody else came along, later Advaitins, who are followers of Shankara, came and tried to refute Ramanuja's refutation. So these debates have been going on for many centuries. Okay.
Thank God God said Thakur.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we'll get to that, exactly. So Ramanuja said, so Shankara says Brahman is ultimately only nirguna, without attributes, impersonal. Ramanuja says Brahman is only personal, with attributes, all auspicious attributes, no negative qualities. He's not evil, he's not, but he's perfectly good, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's the creator of this world. Madhva, Dvaita Vedanta, his understanding of Brahman is very similar to Ramanuja's. He also says, Shankara is totally wrong. They say nasty things about each other, actually. And so he would say that Shankara is deliberately trying to deceive people, and his teachings are demonic. He says all sorts of things. Shankara also says some choice things about other schools. He said, for instance, Shankara said that Buddha was either crazy or a liar, because from his teachings emerged many different schools of Buddhism which conflict with each other. So anyway, all of these, when they engage in debates, they engage in a lot of name calling. I'm just mentioning that to you. So Madhva and Ramanuja claim that Brahman is only saguna, personal, with auspicious attributes, not nirguna. Now, there are two other schools of Vedanta which have an interestingly different view on the nature of Brahman. These are Chaitanya's Achinta Bheda Bheda Vedanta and Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta. Because what they claim, they're both bhakti schools, and they believe that Brahman is Krishna. They love Krishna, supreme, the Bhagavan Krishna. But what they say is Krishna is, of course, Saguna, he's the personal God, but they also accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman, this impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. But what they say is Nirguna Brahman is just a minor aspect of Krishna. And Vallabha, for instance, uses a metaphor. He says that just as in the human body, we have, toes, small toes, which are a small part of us. He says that Nirguna Brahman is like a toe of Bhagavan Krishna. And Chaitanya school, they use the language of, they say that Brahman is the Tanubha or Pratibha of Krishna, which means a peripheral or minor effulgence. It's like a small light emanating from a small aspect of his being. Okay, so unlike Ramanuja and Madhva, these two bhakti schools of Vedanta, Achinta Bheda Veda and Shuddha Dvaita, accept the reality of both Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. And unlike Shankara also, Shankara accepts the reality only of Nirguna Brahman. Ramanuja and Madhva accept the reality ultimately only of Saguna Brahman. But Chaitanya's school of Achinta Veda Vedanta and Vallabha's school accept the reality of both Nirguna and Saguna Brahman. Brahman with attributes and without attributes. But there's still a hierarchy between these two. And they say that Saguna Brahman is in some sense higher and more valuable than Nirguna Brahman, which is just a minor aspect of Krishna. Okay, so this is the context. It's a little bit technical, but it's necessary to understand how Sri Ramakrishna harmonizes the different schools of Vedanta. Now Sri Ramakrishna comes in the 19th century, and he practiced Advaita Vedanta under the great Advaitin wandering monk Totapuri. He attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He remained in that state for 6 months, which is very, very rare. And some sadhu had to come and force some milk down his throat, beat him with a stick to bring his mind down slightly, and then he fed him. So he attained the highest goal of Advaita Vedanta. At the same time, he also practiced many Vaishnava sadhanas. He realized, one sadhu came who was a devotee of Ramlala, the child form of Rama. And Sri Ramakrishna started practicing devotion toward Ramlala, and Ramlala started liking Sri Ramakrishna so much he left that sadhu, Jatadhari. And so he realized God in the form of Ramlala. He realized God in the form of Krishna. He adopted the attitude of Radha for a period of time, dressing like a woman. And then he had the vision of Krishna and Radha. So he had extraordinary experiences in the Vaishnava tradition, while also having the highest realization of Advaita Vedanta. And of course, he had realization of his Ishta Devata, Kali, Mother Kali, Divine Mother Kali. So he had all these different kinds of experiences. And on that basis, he taught that there's one divine reality, which is both nirguna, impersonal, and without attributes, the non-dual pure consciousness of Advaita Vedanta, and which is at the same time the personal God, Saguna Brahman, of Ramanuja, Madhva, Chaitanya, Vallabha, who is the God of love, who responds to our prayers, who is the creator, preserver, and destroyer of this universe, right? But unlike Chaitanya's school and the school of Vallabha, both of whom they place this personal God above the impersonal, saying the impersonal is just a minor aspect of the personal God, Sri Ramakrishna says they are equally valuable. Both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman are equally real, not only equally real, they're equally valuable. So which one, how should I think about God? That might be the question. Now I'm confused. There's so many different ways of thinking about Brahman. What about me? What should I think about? Sri Ramakrishna says, what do you like? What is your preference? What is your temperament? Sri Ramakrishna sometimes in the gospel, in the Kathamrita, he would say that people are born either as an amsha, as a portion of Shiva, or as a portion of Vishnu. Those who are born as a portion of Vishnu tend to have a devotional nature, and they naturally lean toward the personal God. And those who are born of a portion of Shiva tend to have a jnani's nature, a more intellectual nature, and they tend to prefer the path of Advaita Vedanta or Jnana Yoga. And on that basis, what he taught is that he used this metaphor of sugar. He said that bhaktara chini hote chai na, bhaktara chini khete chai. Bhaktas, devotees of God, of the personal God, they don't want to become sugar. They want to eat sugar. So you see, here we get two different ideals. One is realizing your true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. This is the goal of Advaita Vedanta. And the goal of bhaktas is dwelling in a higher loka, an eternal realm, what we call heaven in Western traditions, in an eternal, loving relationship with the personal God. And there are different lokas for different devotees. There's a Christian heaven. There's a Ramakrishna loka for devotees of Ramakrishna. There's Vishnu loka for devotees of Vishnu. There's Vraja loka for the devotees of Krishna, and so on and so forth. And for them, for these bhaktas, they say, I don't want to dwell in non-dual pure consciousness. I don't care about that. I want Krishna, or I want, my God, my personal God. And for them, Sri Ramakrishna says they'll have that. And he says in one place, there's a very important passage. I'm not sure if I quoted it. Basically, Mohima Chakraborty, he was a householder devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, and he loved Advaita Vedanta. And so he once asked Sri Ramakrishna, he said, but bhaktas also ultimately need this highest Advaitic realization, isn't it? Isn't that the case? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, no, that's not true. In some bhakti schools, there's Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. There's the eternal Krishna, the eternal personal God, and eternal bhaktas, eternal devotees of this personal God. And then he says, Chinmoy Shan, Chinmoy Dham in Bengali, which means that this abode, this divine abode, this heaven of the personal God is eternal, and it's nothing but divine consciousness. And Chinmoy Sham means that God himself, this personal God itself, is nothing but the embodiment of consciousness. So the personal God is fully real. These heavens are fully real. And for bhaktas, the highest salvation is dwelling in this loka with the personal God in a loving relationship and serving God and worshiping God. And Sri Ramakrishna does not put one of these ideals, the Advaitic ideal or the Bhakti ideal, above the other one. That's what's important to understand. He gives them equal value and says that it's a matter of preference. Do you want to eat sugar or do you want to become sugar? That's a matter of preference. What kind of cheese do you like? There are a lot of cheeses here in Zurich, you know, Camembert or Brie or whatever. This is, you don't judge someone, you don't say that somebody is, one cheese is objectively better than another one. It's a matter of preference. This seemed to be Sri Ramakrishna's perspective. This is how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the different schools of Vedanta. Very briefly, if you want more details, you can read some of my scholarship that I've done on this. That's the first kind of harmonizing that Sri Ramakrishna engaged in. Again, at the level of, as a spiritual scientist, by actually practicing these different traditions and realizing that the same God is in all of these traditions, just in different forms and aspects. Second, he harmonized the different spiritual practices, the different sadhanas taught in the different Vedantic schools. Not just Vedantic schools, he also practiced the sadhanas in Tantra and in Christianity and Islam. But I'm going to focus now on how he harmonized the spiritual practices in Vedantic schools. Again, we have to have some background in the traditional Vedantic schools. According to Shankaracharya, who is a great Advaita Vedantin, which yoga is the only yoga that leads to moksha, Brahmagyana? Does anyone know? He put one kind of sadhana above the other sadhanas. Which one? Yeah, exactly, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. What is the yoga of knowledge? He would say, you have to, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. These are terms from Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Shravana means you listen from a qualified guru to the Mahavakyas about Advaita. Tat Tvam Asi. You are that Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. I am that non-dual pure consciousness. You hear it first from a qualified guru. Second, Manana. You reflect on the Advaitic teachings of the scriptures. And third, Nididhyasana. You try to assimilate, you try to internalize that insight, that knowledge. And then you attain Brahmagyana. You attain knowledge of Brahman, you attain salvation. You realize your true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. Now, Bhakti Yoga, by contrast, okay, now, so the thing is, no, before I go to Bhakti Yoga, Shankara, he does not say that other paths, other than Jnana Yoga, are useless. He says that they're very valuable, but as preparatory disciplines. So Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, worshiping the personal God, praying, doing bhajans and all these things. These are all very good, he says, for the purpose of purifying the mind and concentrating the mind. Karma Yoga, the yoga of unattached action. He says, excellent. Again, for what purpose? For purifying the mind. Raja Yoga, or the yoga, the Dhyana Yoga is another word for it, the yoga of meditation, the yoga of concentration. He says, that's also very good, but for the purpose of concentrating the mind and purifying the mind. But what is the aim of all this? Once you have a pure mind and a concentrated mind, you become eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice of Jnana Yoga. You become what's called an adhikari to practice Jnana Yoga. So he says there are Manda adhikaris and Uttama adhikaris. Manda adhikaris are inferior spiritual aspirants who are only qualified to practice Bhakti Yoga, devotion, Karma Yoga, Raja Yoga. And because they don't have pure minds and they don't have sufficiently concentrated minds, the moment you have a sufficiently pure and concentrated mind, you stop those practices and you practice only Jnana Yoga. Because only Jnana Yoga can take you to the highest goal, which is knowledge of your true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. Okay? So keep this in mind. This is Shankara's understanding of the scheme of spiritual practices. Jnana Yoga is at the top. It's the only practice that leads directly to knowledge of Brahman. Other practices are good, but they're for inferior spiritual aspirants who do not have sufficiently pure minds. Now come the Bhakti schools of Vedanta. And again, they just say the opposite of what Shankara says almost. So Ramanuja, Madhva, they say that bhakti yoga is the highest practice. The yoga of devotion is the highest practice that leads directly to the highest goal of knowledge of Krishna and love for Krishna. And karma yoga is a lower discipline that helps purify the mind. So here Ramanuja agrees with Shankara. Karma yoga is a lower discipline that helps you in purifying the mind. Ultimately, you want to get to the point where you can practice bhakti yoga. But most of us cannot practice bhakti yoga properly because we have impure minds. We love things of the world rather than God. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, he said, people shed jugfuls of tears because they lose money or because over their spouse or their children. But who cries for God? Who weeps for God? So we like this world more than we like God. That's the problem. So Ramanuja says these different bhakti schools of Vedanta say that karma yoga is very, very useful in purifying the mind so that we can ultimately be an adhikari. We can be qualified to have true love for God. This is the idea. And Jnana Yoga, here's another case of this Wikipedia disambiguation. Jnana Yoga means different things according to different schools of Vedanta. So I already explained what Jnana Yoga means in Shankara school, Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. You reflect on the Advaitic Mahavakyas, the teachings, I am Brahman. Ramanuja also accepts Jnana Yoga, but he understands it in a very different sense. And this afternoon during the guided meditation, we'll be doing what Ramanuja calls Jnana Yoga. And I'll explain it now briefly, and then I'll explain it in more detail later. What Ramanuja calls Jnana Yoga is our true nature is not this body. We are not this body. We are also not the mind. We are eternal souls, eternal individual jivatmas. The Sanskrit term is jivatma. Eternally pure. And that jivatma in us is naturally a bhakta. Naturally, as souls, we are all lovers of God. Our problem is we don't identify with the soul. We identify with this body and with the mind, the body-mind complex. So Jnana Yoga for Ramanuja is the practice of meditating on our true nature, not as this body-mind complex, but as the eternal soul in our heart. Because what he says is, you cannot feel true bhakti for God so long as you are identified with this body and with this mind. You have to identify with the soul, because the soul is a portion of God. The soul itself is divine, and the soul naturally loves God. So the moment you identify with the soul, you will automatically be able to feel bhakti for God. This is the idea. So for Ramanuja, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga go hand in hand. They should be practiced together as much as possible. The yoga of unattached action and the yoga of knowledge, meaning meditation on our true nature as an eternal spiritual entity, an individual soul. Then we become qualified to practice bhakti yoga, which is the highest practice, which is thinking constantly of the personal God. And then we attain the highest goal, which is knowledge of Vishnu Narayana, of the personal God. So in these Vedantic schools, they usually put one spiritual practice above all of the other ones. For Shankara, Jnana Yoga is the highest. For the Bhakti schools of Vedanta, Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Again, how does Sri Ramakrishna harmonize these different spiritual practices? He, and also his chief disciple, Swami Vivekananda, they say that all of these yogas can take you directly to the highest goal. Sri Ramakrishna would say, Jata mat tata pat, as many faiths, so many paths. He would say, Jnana Yoga itself is a path. Bhakti Yoga is also a path. Jnana Bhakti is also a path. He combines them. There's a path where you can combine both. That also is a path. Karma Yoga can also take you to the highest. Raja Yoga can also take you to the highest. And he doesn't bring in these hierarchies, saying one is higher than the other. Again, it's a matter of preference. Which one do you like based on your temperament, based on your preferences? And Swami Vivekananda emphatically says in a number of places, each one of the four yogas is fitted to make man perfect without the help of any of the others. Each yoga is a direct and independent path to the goal of moksha, liberation, the highest goal. So this is the second way that Sri Ramakrishna was a Samanvaya avatara, the avatara of harmony. He harmonized not only the different philosophical schools of Vedanta and the way that they understand the nature of Brahman. He also harmonized the different spiritual practices taught by Vedanta and by other schools. And thirdly, he harmonized the world's religions. Because remember, he didn't just practice Hindu traditions, he also practiced Christianity. He also practiced Islam. Are you familiar? How many of you have read the Leela Prasanga, the great master, the biography of Sri Ramakrishna? Some of you. Most of you, huh? Okay. Okay, so I don't need to go in detail about his Islamic and Christian sadhanas, but in any case, he was given the Allah mantra by most likely a Sufi named Govinda Rai. And through that Islamic practice, he realized God is Allah. That's a brief summary. And with this Christian sadhana, he would often listen to readings from the Bible from one of his disciples, Shambhu Charan Mullik, who was a great lover of Christ. And Sri Ramakrishna would listen to those teachings, try to practice those teachings. And one day he was looking at a picture of Mother Mary with the baby Jesus. And he had an ecstatic vision of the living baby Jesus. And then a few days later, he was walking through a garden and he had a distinct vision of Jesus Christ telling him, I am the Son of God who has died to redeem mankind. And then he saw Jesus merging into his own body. And from that day on, he accepted Jesus as an incarnation of God. He kept a picture of Jesus in his room, and he worshipped Jesus alongside all the Hindu deities that he also had in his room. So he practiced Christianity, Islam, and many different Hindu practices, Tantra, Vaishnavism, Advaita Vedanta. And on that basis, he said, Joto mat toto pot, as many faiths, so many paths. But my favorite teaching is slightly different. He says it's also recorded in the Gospel, Kathamrita. He says in Bangla, Tini ananto, patho ananto. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. And the reason I like this, so my previous book, I wrote a book on Sri Ramakrishna called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So that's based on this teaching, actually. Infinite paths to infinite. The reason why I like this teaching is because he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself is infinite. That's the beauty of this. If God is infinite, logically it follows that there should be infinite paths to God, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is, now, even in our order, even among the monks of our order, there's controversy. How exactly did Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonize the world's religions? This might seem like a simple thing, but it's not. It's a very complicated question.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
I have read more Swamiji than apart from the Kathamrita.
Yeah.
And not the research in many places, Swamiji is saying that there is a need for different paths because society is diverse and diverse cultures have diverse aspirations and different paths would kind of lead to, given their view, their culture, their, let's say, samskaras, a different path would be ideal for that kind of a normative frame. Is that also what you are saying Thakur means by saying that there are infinite paths? Because God is infinite. Are the two the same or are they different?
That's part of what I'm saying. I mean, that's not all of what I'm saying, but that's a part. Sri Ramakrishna used the example of one mother cooking fish dishes for her 5 different children. And the one who's very young, who has a weak stomach, she'll make fish soup because he can't digest fish fry. For another one who has a hardier digestive capacity, she'll make fish fry. For another one, ilish mash, so different kinds. That means it's based on, and then he says, in the same way, God has created different religions to suit different temperaments. So there are certain people who, based on their tendencies from previous births, they have a devotion for Christ. So then they'll be born in Christian countries and they'll follow the teachings of the Bible. Others who follow Islam, others who follow different traditions of Hinduism, others who like Buddhism. So that's a part of it. But one thing I wanted to clarify, which I think is very important, there's a kind of confusion in the order, outside the order, among devotees. How did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world's religions? There are 2 very different ways of thinking about it. Okay, and I don't want to force any ideas down your throat. I'm just presenting the two different ideas, and I'll tell you which one I prefer and why, and then you can think for yourselves and decide. One way is, this is very common when monks explain how Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonize the world of religions. They'll say this. They'll say that the basis of all religions is Advaita Vedanta. They'll say that the highest goal is Advaitic realization of non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? And that other religions, non-Advaitic paths like Christianity, Islam, Bhakti schools within Hinduism, theistic schools, Sikhism, all these schools, they're all good. They're wonderful. What they do is they can take you part of the way. You will have realization of Saguna Brahman, the personal God, but that's not the highest. That's not the highest. Ultimately, you have to go beyond the personal God, and then it gets a little bit complicated. Do you have to practice Jnana Yoga in order to realize this highest Advaitic state, or can you continue on your path of Christianity? There's slight controversy about that, but if you're a strict Advaitin, if you're a strict follower of Shankara, you have to give up those practices. All those bhakti, the devotional practices, you have to start practicing Jnana Yoga, and then you realize this Advaitic non-dual pure consciousness. So bhakti schools, devotional religions can take you part of the way, but not all the way. This is one way of understanding how Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonize the world of religion. Advaita is the highest. And based on this idea of Advaita, we can appreciate the harmony of the different religions, but nonetheless, the non-Advaitic schools are on a lower footing. They can take you part of the way, but not all of the way. And then the second way of understanding how Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonize the world religions is based more along the lines of the philosophy that I've been explaining in this lecture today, which is that the ultimate reality, the highest divine reality, is not only impersonal, but also personal. Both the personal God and the impersonal Brahman are equally real and equally valuable, which means that all of the world's religions can be placed on an equal footing. Through the practice of Christianity, I can directly realize the highest goal, which is not necessarily the Advaitic realization. Christians don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. Devotees of the personal God in general, they don't want to become sugar, so why force them to become sugar? You see, this is the idea. So then for them, the highest goal is residing in the Christian heaven. For Muslims, it's residing in their heaven with Allah. Yeah.
Again, from conversations with a colleague of mine.
Yeah.
That the concept of Allah is actually quite unreal.
Well, no, because it's nirakara but saguna. So the Sanskrit term nirakara means formless, but saguna, personal. It's definitely a personal God. They don't believe in the impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness. They wouldn't accept that at all.
So there can be emotion in that sense.
The whole school is Islam. The word means surrender to the personal God. The word Islam means you're literally surrendering. You don't surrender to non-dual pure consciousness. You surrender to the personal God. It's a theistic school, but they don't believe in the personal God with form. They believe in nirakara saguna. We should distinguish these two things. There are two axes. One is nirakara sakara, so God with form, God without form. And then the other axis is saguna and nirguna. Many people confuse these things, but it's important to keep them separate.
It's also very interesting because Swamiji talks about the Vedantic claim in an Islamic body. And there he says that Vedanta had the best ideas, but his followers did not practice them properly. However, Islam had a much better practice of the egalitarian nature of God.
Yeah, everyone's a brother. The moment you enter the Islamic faith, then everybody's treated equally. And Swamiji would say that in India, we teach the highest theory, that everybody is the same Atman. But in practice, there's a caste system. There are 100 ways that we talk about, I'm higher than you, I'm better than you, and this and that. He says, and in one place, he says that practical Vedanta, you'll find more in the West than in India. With that real democratic sense that everybody is equal. Yeah. Thank you for that point.
Can we ask questions or
please? So yeah. So let me just make sure.
I thought actually we have Q&A session.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but we can start it now if you want. I mean, because I'm more or less I've completed what I wanted to say, which is that there are these three ways that I think that Sri Ramakrishna was a very unique avatar, a very unique incarnation of God. He harmonized the different conceptions of God in the different schools of Vedanta by conceiving God in a very, very broad way, a very expansive way, as both non-dual pure consciousness and as the personal God. And the personal God here can take many different forms. And he gave equal status to all of them: Kali, Krishna, Rama, Shiva, all of them, Allah, Christ. Second, he harmonized the different spiritual practices in the different traditions throughout the world by giving equal status to the spiritual practice of devotion, bhakti yoga, the practice of knowledge, jnana yoga, karma yoga, the practice of unattached action taught in the Bhagavad Gita and other texts, and the path of meditation, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and all these things. He says all of these can take you directly to the highest goal. And he didn't bring in hierarchy, saying some practices are higher than others. And third, he harmonized all of the world religions without placing one religion above all the others. That's what I wanted to conclude with. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions.
I have a couple of questions, Maharaj.
Yeah.
First of all, regarding Sri Ramakrishna's quotation on Hanuman.
Yeah.
How does he feel about God?
Yeah.
So there actually he says, if I feel as body, then I actually see God as a different entity. So in that context, do we say that feeling as a body or mind or beyond body and mind are all at the equal levels?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was talking to Shuntu about this yesterday, actually. So what you're referring to is in the gospel, Sri Ramakrishna would often quote Hanuman as saying, the exact quotation is slightly different from what you're saying. What Hanuman would say is, when I identify with the body, I say, I am your servant. When I identify with the Jivatma, the individual soul, I say, and he's addressing Rama, he's addressing God. I say, I am a portion of you. I am an amsha of you. And when I realize my true nature as Brahman, I say, I am you and you are I. This is the teaching. Now, what Sri Ramakrishna says is, the context is very important. You have to look at the context. And the context is, in many places, you'll find him saying, Jnanis dismiss all three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, but I accept all the states. He says this in many places. And in that context, he says, and it's another thing, he says, I have a flute. He says, why should I play only one note on the flute? Well, I want to play ragas and raginis, using all 7 notes. And then he often will bring in this Hanuman statement and say, I like to think of myself, I like to commune with God, I like to realize God in many different ways. You see what I mean? Now, there's a sadhu named Shantinath. He was a Bengali sadhu who was a contemporary of Swami Turiyanandaji, and he met Turiyanandaji. He wrote an autobiography called Experiences of a Truth Seeker. And in one chapter of that book, he describes a debate he had with Turiyanandaji about this Hanuman shloka. So I recommend, I can give you the reference. You can download the PDF. And there, so this Shantinath was a staunch Shankarite. He was an Advaita Vedantan. And because he was a strict follower of Shankara, he stopped all of his bhakti practices. He didn't believe in the personal God. And he's walking with Turiyanandaji, and he noticed that when Turiyanandaji was walking past a temple for the Divine Mother, he bowed down instinctively and he worshipped. And Shantinath found it very quaint and strange. He said, you're talking about Advaita Vedanta, but you're bowing down to these idols. It's very foolish. And then Turiyanandaji smiled and he repeated the Hanuman shloka. Exactly what I explained to you just now. And then Shantinath said, but the Hanuman, just as what you're saying, Vamsi. Shantinath says, but the Hanuman shloka supports Advaita Vedanta because it's saying that so long as I ignorantly identify with the body, ignorantly identify with the Jivatma, then I think that I'm a servant of God, I'm an amsha, a portion of God. But when I realize the truth, the highest truth, then I realize I am that non-dual pure consciousness. So Hanuman supports me, not your views. And then Turiyanandaji, they have a very interesting debate about this. And Turiyanandaji brings in Sri Ramakrishna's ideas to interpret the Hanuman shloka in a different way. Basically saying that everything is real. Remember, so this is something I've written about in detail in my books, but I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta. And the reason is because he placed a great importance on this spiritual experience of Vijnana. And he says that after the attainment of Brahman, in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, after attaining the knowledge that you are non-dual pure consciousness, there's a small minority of divinely commissioned souls, which he called Ishvara Kotis, Ishwar Koti, who can come back to this relative plane, and he has a very special kind of realization. He realizes, the Vijnani realizes that Vijnani dekhe jini nirgun tini shogun, which means the Vijnani sees that that infinite divine reality, which is nirguna, impersonal, is also personal. And secondly, the Vijnani dekhe Brahmoi Chaturpinshi Tattva hoyeche. Brahman itself has become the 24 cosmic principles. Brahman has become absolutely everything in this world, which means, coming back to the Hanuman shloka, this body itself is Brahman. The Jivatma is Brahman. The mind is Brahman. And so when Sri Ramakrishna says, I don't want to play one note on the flute, and he says, just saying soham, I am Brahman, I am Brahman, that would be like playing one note. I want to play ragas and raginis. I want to sometimes think of myself as non-dual pure consciousness. Other times I want to dwell with, I want to worship Krishna. Other times Christ. Other times Allah. Right? That's the ragas and raginis. And all of them are true. Because everything is Brahman. There are just, you can think of them as different levels of consciousness. And you can enjoy God in different ways at different levels of consciousness. So that's a somewhat long answer to the question.
And okay, so basically Advaita, Vishnadvaita, and Dvaita philosophies, they were actually suitable based on Deshakala Patra. Maybe in the 8th century, we needed Advaita philosophy because at that time Buddhism was actually deteriorating. Afterwards, we might have required Vishishtadvaita, and afterwards we might have required Advaita philosophy, because not everybody can follow Advaita philosophy, and not everybody was actually meant for Vishishtadvaita. Not everybody was actually.
But the problem is they didn't come chronologically. I mean, the thing is, before Advaita, there was Bheda schools.
Yes.
Bhakti Prapancha. And during Ramanuja's time, there were also Advaitans. So it's not, you can't say it so neatly that at one time we needed one thing, because there have always been bhaktas.
But
yeah.
For 8th century,
yeah.
do you agree that we required Shankaracharya?
No, some of us required Shankara, others did not. I mean, that's what I would say, is that, as Sri Ramakrishna said, Ruchi Bhed, Adhikari Bhed. There's a difference in temperament, difference in preference. Some people just instinctively don't like the idea of God as pure consciousness. They can only think of God as the personal God, the God of love. For them, what's the need of Shankara? I mean, that's not, I wouldn't agree with that.
Bhajagovindam was written by Shankaracharya.
Most likely not. Most likely not. So when I was in training center in Beluma, our principal, Jushtanandaji, now he's left his body a few years ago. He was a great scholar of Shankara. He translated many of Shankara's Sanskrit commentaries into Bangla. And he told us, if you want to understand Shankara, you have to rely on the Prasthanatraya Bhashya, his commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. We don't know whether he composed all these other works, because what happens in India is that the moment somebody becomes very famous and prestigious, we start saying that that person wrote 100 other texts, which he may not have written. And so if you want to understand Shankara's views, you have to rely on these texts which are known to be his, and Upadesha Sastri is also known to be his. These are the 4 texts: commentary on Upanishads, commentary on Bhagavad Gita, commentary on Brahma Sutra, and the Upadesha Sastri. And if you can show that he was a bhakta based on those texts, then we can have a discussion. But if you bring in Bhaja Govindam, it becomes problematic, or Viveka Chudamani, or this and that, and 100 other texts. We have to, let's focus on a common agreed upon source of evidence. That would be the Prasthanatraya Bhashya.
And do you have an opinion that Savikalpa Samadhi and Nirvikalpa Samadhi are same?
No.
Or at the same level?
Same. Yeah, it depends on what school you're talking. So the different schools of philosophy define these terms in different ways. But if you're saying the realization of the personal God and the realization of one's true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, then yes. So, no difference in value.
So because you're actually saying one set of monks believe in the gradation of these 3 philosophies.
Not monks, acharyas. Yeah, I mean, these were the great, I mean, they were also monks, but yeah.
Segregating the monks in the Ramakrishna order.
Oh, I see. You're talking about the monks in the order.
Yeah.
Oh, so what's the question? Yeah.
We actually are segregated into two categories. One actually are saying all these three are in different levels, and some actually are saying all of these three are at the same level.
Yeah, I mean, basically, some monks in our order believe that Advaita is the highest, and they put other paths on a lower footing.
But you're actually also saying that after realizing the personal God, if they are actually following the Advaita philosophy stringently, then we should actually follow Jnana Marga.
Yeah, correct.
To reach the Advaita.
That's
philosophy.
Shankara's view. Yeah, yeah.
But there are also monks actually who say that we don't need to follow the Jnana Marga.
Yeah, correct.
Still, we have these layers.
Yeah, correct. That's a slightly more liberal view. The idea is that Christians, through the practice of Christianity, they'll first realize God as personal, as Christ, and then just by God's grace, they can ultimately attain Brahma Jnana also, this Advaitic realization. Yeah. But as I said, that's not the most liberal view. The most liberal view is God himself is both personal and impersonal, and the realization of the personal God is the highest for them. You don't have to go on to become sugar. If all you want to do is eat sugar, then that's enough.
Then how do you interpret the question of Thakur to Swamiji when Swamiji was saying, okay, the question was, what do you do if you have let me put it in a good way. Thakur was actually asking Swamiji if there is a honeybee and it has a honey syrup.
Well, a fly, machi.
Fly, yeah. And actually, that in that context, how do you actually?
See, the metaphor there is a bit different. I mean, it's about the sea of immortality, amrita. And the question is, do you want to dwell on the cup of on the lip of the cup, and then dip down and just taste it once in a while, or do you want to dive in? And then Swamiji says, well, naturally, I want to sit on the lip of the cup, because otherwise I'll sink and drown. And then Swamiji says, there's no drowning in the sea of immortality. But that's not a specifically Advaitic context. I mean, that's just God in general.
No,
that can also be
what
the
I'm
personal.
trying to say
Yeah.
Once you actually reach the personal aspect of God,
yeah,
you will actually immerse in God. That's what I'm trying to say. Basically, you.
No, but that's not. But again, that's becoming sugar, right? Where Sri Ramakrishna says bhaktas want to eat sugar, they don't want to.
They don't want to, but they become sugar.
Not everyone does. That's exactly.
No. What I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. They may not want to.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they may become.
They may, but they may not.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
But they may not.
They may.
But you accept that they may not also.
Yes.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. So some bhaktas ultimately they may want to go on to the Advaita.
Without even realizing that they are becoming, but they may become.
They may. So the problem is Advaitins. The problem is they force everybody to become.
But
so that's not a liberal. That becomes illiberal.
You don't even need to go to Advaita or Jnana Marga all the time, but
yeah,
you can actually agree that.
Yeah. Again, it's about preference.
Yeah.
I if I lived in Zurich for 20 years and I suddenly say I want to move to Varanasi, then I can move to Varanasi. That's a matter of preference. Yeah. So Sri Ramakrishna was very, very broad.
The supremacy of Advaita. How does one reconcile the fact that Thakur, like you said, with this Hanuman thing, that the body is, everything is basically Brahman.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile with the fact that he also said that Brahma Satya, Jagat Mithya? How are those two reconciled? And secondly, how do you reconcile the fact that, when he gives the analogy of the ocean and say that look, icebergs form
correct.
influence.
Yeah.
And that's equivalent and that's great. But doesn't that presuppose that when the sun of knowledge shines and the iceberg melts, the part becomes whole?
Yeah.
Isn't the whole superior to a part?
Yeah, these are nice questions. So the first one is about, well, Sri Ramakrishna is sometimes taught Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Doesn't that support Advaita Vedanta? Thing is, this is something that when we get to our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class, what time is that at? 2 o'clock. Before one of the things I'll be talking about is how should we try to understand Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings in the Gospel? And one thing that's extremely important to keep in mind is context. Context, and another thing is what I call verbal cues. So one example I already gave, but I'll mention it again. So sometimes he says, Gyani ra bole. Gyani say, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Ami kintu. But I say, all these states are true. Or I say, but why should we dismiss this world as unreal? I say that the world itself is God. So there, of course, he says, if you take the passage out of context, you see he's saying Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, but you have to take the context, which is that I don't agree with the Gyanis. I believe, and so the way I put the slogan, this is how I characterize Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Because Shankara, Brahman is just Nirguna, but Sri Ramakrishna says Brahma Shakti Abhed, which means Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman, is one with. It's inseparable from the personal God. So they're both equally real. So that's why I call it Brahma Shakti Satyam. According to Sri Ramakrishna, Brahma Shakti is true. And therefore the world is true. How can the world be true? Because it's a manifestation of Shakti. It's a real manifestation of Shakti. So that's the answer to the first question, which is that was not his ultimate standpoint. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya was what he said was the Jnani standpoint, but he was a Vijnani. He said it in one place. The divine mother has kept me in the state of a Vijnani, not a Jnani. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is this very important metaphor that Sri Ramakrishna often used about an infinite ocean of divine consciousness, which he said in certain places, due to the cooling influence of bhakti, that the ocean water forms into different ice formations, which he likens to different forms of the personal God. Kali, Krishna, Christ, Allah, right? And then he says, but with the rising of the sun of knowledge, these forms melt. And what's left? Well, that infinite divine consciousness. Again, Advaitins will be very happy with this metaphor and say, then that the highest means the highest is when these personal gods disappear. Like when Sri Ramakrishna was practicing Advaita and he couldn't get past Kali between his eyebrows. He said, he told Totapuri, I'm getting stuck with Kali here. And then Totapuri takes the shard of glass, pricks him between the eyebrows, and then he cuts Kali in half with the sword of knowledge, and he soars into the plane of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So they say, see, this is like that. That metaphor is supporting the Advaitic standpoint. Advaita is higher than bhakti. However, there are certain places in the gospel where Sri Ramakrishna adds a very, very important qualification to this metaphor. Do any of you know what that qualification is before I mention it? That's not the end of the story. The way that he explains the Son of Knowledge comes. He says, in some places, the ice does not melt. It becomes like quartz. Nitya Shakar, he says. Nitya Shakar means it's eternally God with form, the personal God with form. That's what throws a wrench into this Advaitic interpretation. And that is perfectly consistent with what he says elsewhere when Mohima Chakravarti, the Advaitin, says, but wait a minute, all bhaktas ultimately need Advaitic realization. He says, no, it's not the case. Because there's also Nitya Sakara, Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta, Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. So if you, again, the context is important. The forms of ice don't always melt. That's the basic point, which means that for some bhaktas, the personal God can be the highest. That's the answer to the second part of this question. Any other questions?
How do you practice jnana yoga, the highest yoga? I always thought to come to the highest step, you have to go through bhakta, raja yoga.
Right. Well, that's Shankara's view. That's what I was calling Shankara's Advaita.
I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. But how do you practice this jnana yoga?
How do you practice jnana yoga?
Yeah, this highest yoga.
Yeah, so I told you the basic idea, which is just you have to reflect on the fact that and try to internalize the fact that your true nature is not this body, not the mind, not even the individual soul, but non-dual pure consciousness.
Okay, you
That's
keep that always in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, again, if you're a strict follower of Shankara, 99.9999% of people in the world are not qualified to practice Advaita Vedanta, the path of knowledge. Why? Does anyone know why? Yeah, that's Sri Ramakrishna's language, Annagata Pran, but what about Shankara's language? What do we need to qualify to practice? Sadhana Chatushtaya. We need the fourfold sadhana. We have to have mastered the fourfold sadhana before we are eligible to practice the path of knowledge. This is strict Shankara. I can quote it. It's from the very beginning of his commentary on the Brahma Sutra. On the very first sutra, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. What is this fourfold sadhana? Viveka, discrimination between what is permanent, what is impermanent, what is real, what is not real. Vairagya, intense dispassion for worldly pleasures. Right? Third, Shat Sampat, the 6 treasures. And these are Shama, Dhamma, and all these other things, self-restraint, control of the senses, control of the mind, all these things. And then finally, mumukshutva, intense longing for liberation. Almost nobody in this world has those that fourfold sadhana. Therefore, according to Shankara, almost none of us are qualified to practice Jnana Yoga. So that's the reason why we all love Sarvapriyanji's lectures and we love thinking about ourselves and not do Prakash. But why does nothing happen? Because we're not qualified. That's a short answer. Yeah.
When Thakur said that at some place the ice does not melt,
Ice, yeah.
Does it mean that there the sun did not rise?
That what?
The sun did not rise at that place?
No, but just that the sun of knowledge is not powerful enough even to dissolve those forms of the personal God. It rises, but it's not strong enough to melt that ice. Yeah.
Swamiji,
Yeah.
did,
Then I'll come back to
I'm
it.
sorry.
Yeah, no, first go ahead. and
I'm
then-
asking my question, so you.
Okay, yeah.
When did Thakur put such a notice when he said in part of the gospel, oh, finally Vivekananda accepted my mother? Because there was really a part when Swami Vivekananda rejected.
Yeah.
And he puts it as a very important aspect. Well, I understood it, right?
Yeah.
Is it correct? And why? Can you
Yeah, well,
comment this?
please read chapter 1 of my new book because I discussed this actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're referring to, I think it was 1884, when Sri Ramakrishna, in a very good mood, he says, Narayan has finally accepted my mother. And there's a question about what incident Sri Ramakrishna is referring to, because he didn't mention exactly what. Some people think that it has to do with after his father died in, I think, February 1884, he was destitute and he kept going to Sri Ramakrishna and saying, please pray to your mother for basic necessities because my family is starving now. I'm helpless. I'm the oldest son. I have to take care of my family. And Sri Ramakrishna, he said, go pray to her yourself. And then Naren went to the Dakshineshwar Kali temple and he was planning. He was mentally prepared to pray for food and clothing and shelter. And the moment he saw Kali in the temple, he went in this ecstatic mood and he could only pray for Viveka, Vairagya, Bhakti. He completely forgot about his material needs and the needs of his family. And then he came out of the temple again, he became normal again. And then he went to Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Ramakrishna smiled and said, have you prayed to mother for your family's welfare? He said, no, I asked for bhakti. And then go again. That this play happened 3 times. And then finally Narayan realized Sri Ramakrishna was playing tricks on me. So it's possible that was the incident that Sri Ramakrishna was referring to. But in any case, there's a very important moment in 1884, late 1884, I think, when Sri Ramakrishna finally declares Narayan has finally accepted mother. And the other thing that's important, which I discuss in detail in the first chapter of my new book, is I try to show that Sri Ramakrishna groomed Swamiji in 2 phases. The first phase was when he first came to him in either late 1881 or very early 1882. He was a follower of the Brahma Samaj, which is like we were talking about Islam believing in Nirakara Saguna Brahman. Brahma Samaj is like that. They're theists, they're bhaktas, but they don't believe in the forms of God. So they don't believe in idol worship. They believe in God with form, but personal. So Swamiji came to Sri Ramakrishna as a theist, believing in a formless but personal God. The first thing Sri Ramakrishna did was convert him into an Advaita Vedantin. How did he do it? By touching him on the chest, and he flew into that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he said, read Ashtavakra Samhita, which is a hardcore Advaitic text. And so he was training him to be basically a classical Advaita Vedantin, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Starting in 1884, and this is one of these incidents that's very important, Sri Ramakrishna starts to move Swamiji away from the world denying Advaita Vedanta and the Shakti denying Advaita Vedanta of Shankara school, and to what I call integral Advaita. It's what I call Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, but in the context of Swamiji, I call it integral Advaita. It's still Advaita, but it's an Advaita that's all-encompassing, that accepts the reality of Shakti, it accepts the reality of this world as a real manifestation of Shakti. And there are a few very, very important incidents like that one, but there are other ones. For instance, Swamiji tells his guru one day, I want to just be immersed in Nirvikalpa Samadhi and come down once in a while for food, Sri Ramakrishna scolds him severely and says, "How shame on you. I thought you would be like a great banyan tree giving shade to thousands. Now I see you're selfish. You only care for your own salvation. Aren't you the one who sing, 'Oh Lord, you are everything in this world? All that exists is you.'" So the way I interpret these incidents, and there are many others, you look at the period from 1884 to 1886 in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you'll find explicitly, and I quote these things from the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna saying to Naren, after explaining the Jnani's doctrine, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, he says, Sri Ramakrishna says, Maya kintu shukno. Maya, this doctrine of Maya is dry. And then he looks at Naren, he says, "Repeat that to me." Then Naren says, "Maya doctrine is dry." And then Sri Ramakrishna gets very happy. And then Sri Ramakrishna explains the Vijnana doctrine to Swamiji and says, you should accept all four states. You should accept this entire world as a real manifestation of God. You should accept Mother Shakti as also real. And so I see that incident that you're referring to as part of this broader second phase in the grooming of Naren by Sri Ramakrishna away from the world negating Advaita Vedanta of Shankara and toward his own Vijnana Vedanta kind of integral Advaita philosophy. That's what I say. Thank you.